Welcome into a new BuffStampede Radio. Adam Munsterteiger, the publisher of BuffStampede.com, joined by senior staff writer Sean Niehoff, and we're here to go through some topics as the Buffaloes are set to begin spring ball on March 11th. It's coming up pretty quickly here, but we're shooting this at the Hungry Toad in Boulder, 2543 Broadway in Boulder, just north of Pearl Street. They serve up heart homemade fare from their scratch kitchen, paired with a brilliant selection of British beers. Did you get a British beer over there?
I did. Cheers. I got my Guinness.
The Hungry Toad is the perfect spot for friends and family to gather, relax, and enjoy the warm, welcoming atmosphere. And we've got a bunch of diehard CU fans that are going to join up with us, so it's a great spot just to gather. Have you been to the Hungry Toad before?
I have not. This is my first time, so
okay.
It's got a cool vibe. I like
so
it.
Afterwards, you got to try some of the food here. It's really good. So
I'm looking forward to that.
So I might push this podcast a little quicker along so I get to that menu that they have here at the Hungry Toad. What are you looking forward to when we look ahead to spring ball? Are there some things that you're kind of anxious to chart or follow as we get into them?
It's just, like always, it's just answering a lot of questions. I think my biggest thing is trying to really see who steps up and who emerges in the leadership roles. That's been one of those things when Prime came in and he brought so many guys with him that kind of slotted right into that, and he had some newcomers come, but with Shedeur and Shiloh to an extent, and then Travis, who was maybe more of a leader by example the first year in Colorado. Last year started to become a little more comfortable in a more verbal social role, and then you had guys like LeJontay Wester and Chidozie Nwanko was a good leader. So you had a lot of those guys that were upperclassmen that had come in already, and so now with the turnover, I'm just curious to see kind of who steps into that role, because that was the big key, I think, for me last year. One of the big keys was that there was so much unity. Like that team really liked each other. It was a real family feel. And they did a really good job. The player-led group did a really good job of pulling that all together. So who steps up and fills that void this year? That's number one for me.
It has been good to see some guys stepping up and being more vocal than they were a year ago. But yeah, you've got to get further into the depths of off-season before I
absolutely
feel like you really know it. And yeah, in the portal era, it is important to have guys that have been around, have kind of taken ownership of the program, so they can, obviously fill those guys in when they get to campus. That was on my list as well, leadership, just in terms of, can this be a player-led team in 2025? Number one on my list, I just want to see Marshall Falk coaching Colorado's running backs. How cool is that going to be?
Yeah, that is so cool. That was number, I guess, kind of number 3 on my list, which was a part of the whole, just eager to see all of the various coaching changes and how all that shakes out, with obviously Marshall Falk kind of headlining that. As a third gold jacket in Boulder, and somebody that's so well respected as one of the greats to ever play the game. And how does that translate into him helping the running back room take the next step?
Yeah. A healthy Cam Michael was on my list as well, and I'm just singling one player out here because of one thing: speed.
Yeah.
I want to see. We didn't get a chance to see that. He came in, got hurt pretty early on, but I remember when he was being recruited by Colorado, the thing I kept hearing is he will go into college football games as often the fastest guy on that football field.
Yep.
And so I'm anxious to see what that looks like. Well, what else do you have on your list?
I've got, I think one of the big things that I'm interested in that I think everybody is what is Pat Shurmur's offensive identity going to be without Shedeur Sanders? And how much of the offense that was run was just because you had that talent that you could rely on, and arguably the best offensive player on the team to steer everything. So what changes? How does it look different? He obviously has a quarterback room with some very disparate skills, and so how does he implement that and try to let the cream rise to the top with that? And I think everybody wants to see the combination of new coaches and potentially a modified scheme without Shedeur that highlights the running game a little bit more. So what does that look like in spring ball?
Yeah, totally. There was some thought that maybe you'd have to have a different offense if it's Caden Salter or if it's Julian Lewis. Phillip Dukes made a good point in the sense that you look at Julian Lewis's stats in high school, and he, I think, had only like 3 rushing touchdowns, a very low number. And his point was he didn't really have to run the ball.
Right.
And there are some clips when you watch Julian Lewis's film where you do see the athleticism. So is he going to be as efficient in that system from day one as a Salter that's been doing that now at the college level for as long as he has? Probably not. So you'd probably have to tailor things a little bit. But I don't necessarily know if you really need a completely different offense depending on who the quarterback is.
Well, and not that it worked out tremendously, last year, but they really tried to run a RPO-heavy scheme last year with Shedeur, and they obviously didn't want to run him a lot, and later in the season, I think he ran a little bit more, and whether it was his own design or just their willingness to say, all right, we need to get to the number of wins. We're making the push to try to be in the conference championship game. But you saw that emerge a little bit, and so I think in some ways the quarterback that you have behind center dictates how involved the quarterback actually is in that scheme. But it's I think you can run a very similar offense with Julian Lewis, and obviously if Caden Salter plays, then you add an extra dimension.
Obviously a lot of intriguing quarterback battles. On the other side of our ad break here in a minute, we're going to do our pre-spring predictions on who's going to start for the Colorado Buffaloes. And then, Sean, you and I are going to come back after those 15 spring practices and see how much changed over the course of that. So I usually call them way too early predictions. So we should not be doing that, but just for fun to see how did our thinking change over the course of those practices. One last thing I had here on my notes in terms of things I'm really anxious to see this spring is kind of building off your earlier point about player leadership. I want to see what the chemistry looks like between Domata Peko, Warren Sapp, and George Hilo, because we kept hearing throughout last offseason, throughout the season, that the 3 guys they had there, obviously with Damian Lewis moving on, and Vincent Dancy moving on as well. Those 3 guys were so well connected. Are we going to see that same chemistry out of those 3 guys?
Yeah, and that was part of my broader, number 3 point about the coaching staff changes and seeing how all that plays out. I feel that the loss of Damian Lewis and Vincent Dancy is, the combination of that's probably the biggest loss to the team, just in terms of the chemistry that the coaches had and how they got their units to really progress and play throughout the course of the season. For me, just personally, I don't feel that, I was never a huge Phil Oldholt fan, so I don't feel like that's a big loss, and I like that they've tried to replicate in some fashion what they did with the defensive line last year, with the personalities that they're bringing in and getting integrated in that offensive line group. So I think Andre Gerard is going to be, he's been coaching for the last couple of years at a couple of different levels, and so he's got a little bit of coaching chops, but I think more than anything, it's the personality that he's going to bring, the impose your will attitude that he brings, and then you've got George Hegeman, who's going to become more actively involved, and we've heard good things about Gunner for the last couple of years. So now he has his chance to step up, and eventually everybody needs that opportunity. So I'm excited to see how all that plays out, and then. On the defensive line, like you said, how does Domata Peko and George Hilo integrate? And I think it was no coincidence that when George Hilo emerged on the CU staff last year, that the inside linebackers, specifically Nakai Hill-Green, improved, that their play picked up, and that was a good unit. So I'm kind of curious to see, how that whole thing plays out too. Nothing against Andre Hart. I think the players love him. I think he's a good coach in his own right. But is there some sort of an interaction with Hilo and Hart and the edge line group with the linebackers as well, like there was with the whole defensive line group last year, that kind of integrates some of their mindset and thinking, along those same lines? So I'm just really curious to see how that starts playing out.
Anything else on the list?
I think, one of my big things, and I think I know the answer to it already, but I'm curious to see how Coach Prime handles the season, and whether the loss of his, 3 sons, plus a lot of the other players that he brought in with him, and also this, whatever's behind it. There's been all kinds of rumors, but the fact that there has not been an extension and a deal done, how does all that play out with him? And does he lose any of his edge? I think, as we go through the off season, nothing ever happens on the fans' timetable, but I think we've seen with the backfilling of some of these positions that he's still very engaged. He's still very active. The recruiting, both through the portal and also the high school recruiting has been better than we've seen at Colorado in decades. So, I think the sentiment is probably that it's business as usual along that front, but I'm just curious to see how that plays out with him.
That's a tough transition for any father to go through in life.
Sure.
And I think the best thing for him is to be in this environment, because he's going to be surrounded by guys that we've seen him really just adopt some of these kids and with the nicknames and everything. And I think that is a great place to be when you're in this transition. I'm sure there's going to be some times where it's tough, but I think the right place is for him to be around young people, because he's so good at it. That's why all these NFL rumors, and I don't know, at some point, is there going to become validity to it? If there's an opportunity down the road for him to coach Shedeur, it's impossible to say, but as he said from day one, that's just not what he wants out of the game of football at this point of his life. And that's why he was able to convince that passion for that is why Marshall Falk is now in Boulder as well. So today's episode is brought to us by Macaulay Capital Fractional CFO Services. Is your business looking for financial guidance and support, but not yet big enough to hire a full-time CFO? Well, we have a solution for you. Hiring a fractional CFO who can work with your business on a part-time basis. You get the benefit of having a seasoned financial expert on your team without the commitment or expense of a full-time hire. And here's the best part. It's likely that a partnership with Macaulay Capital will be a win-win situation, meaning that your business will make more money from the guidance of a fractional CFO than the total cost of partnering with us. For more information or to set up a meeting, please visit MacaulayCapital.com. That's MCCAULEY Capital.com. All right, let's get into our pre-spring predictions. Do you want to go starting at quarterback, or do you want to start at the back end and work our way to quarterback?
Well, let's start at quarterback, just because I think that's the biggest question that everybody's, is on everybody's mind, and I think most people have probably already picked their horse and what they want to see happen. So it's, so now let's see how it, I don't think we're going to have a quarterback coming out of spring, a named quarterback. I think they want to see what they've got out of all this, but I kind of feel that for a variety of reasons that by the time we get out of spring and heading into fall camp, that it's going to be Caden Salter's job to lose.
Like I said before the break, we are definitely going to revisit this many times before we get to the season, so way too early predictions. I agree with you. There, in my opinion, won't be a starting quarterback coming out of spring ball, and part of that is you got to give Julian Lewis some time. You're not going to be quite as polished as a senior quarterback that's run, we would assume, a lot of the stuff that they're planning to run going forward offensively. Everything that I've heard about Julian Lewis has been people raving about not just what he can do physically, but calling the coaches late at night, trying to get into the indoor practice facility to work out, throw to guys.
Yep.
So there's no, he's somebody that drew a big social media presence, but this is a pretty grounded guy, especially for being, he should be a junior in high school right now.
Right.
So it's really impressive. And I think that he's got the right attitude to really push Caden Salter, but you just have to go with the experience at that position right now. And so I agree with you.
And if we're going to talk about what we think is going to happen versus what we want to see happen, I think for me is that I would feel more comfortable if Caden Salter was the starting quarterback on day one, but I want to see Julian Lewis active and playing and not redshirting, and I want to see them come up with a plan to get him meaningful snaps and meaningful packages throughout the season.
Yeah. What though, let's say we get into a couple weeks of camp and we keep hearing that they're neck and neck. Then would your opinion there change, given that like this is a quarterback that's going to be in your program for a while, and you've got many years to cultivate that talent?
Yeah, I think potentially it does.
But maybe not, because those aren't live bullets.
Well, and some of my concerns though really come down to the live bullet concerns, and it's not really execution. It really comes down to the fact that Julian Lewis is not a big quarterback to begin with, and and so he may play more mature than his 17 years, but he's still potentially a grown man mind inside of a kid's body. He's still 17 years old. He's not physically matured and developed, and I would, especially as you continue to go through this process of having, some pretty significant offensive line turnover year after year, and trying to find a unit that really comes together, that just gives me a little bit of pause. So if you can let him physically develop while still giving him meaningful game reps and getting him up to speed at the college level, I just think that kind of fits everybody's needs.
Not necessarily who gets the first carry, but who is Colorado's lead back going into the season? Who has the most carries in that season opener against Georgia Tech?
Based on last year, I would have to say that it's Isaiah Augusta. I think he's the most well-rounded back out of the group. I don't know that we got to really see what any of the backs bring to the table last year. It was just such a limited role. But I think that he's the guy that when it's all said and done, I think gives them the best opportunity to do a lot of things. But I'm excited to see them all. I think I still believe that it's probably not going to be a bell cow back. I think we're probably still going to see all four backs contribute, with everybody, working hard like they did, at the end of the season, to try to get Charlie Offerdahl some carries as well, because, as great a story as he is, he also always seems to be a favorite of his teammates. His work ethic is undeniable. But I think it's going to be great to be able to get, Brendan Hood's speed on the field. I think that there were some ways that they started utilizing Dallin Hayden last year that I think they may try to implement a little bit more. I think he was very effective in some of the passing game stuff that they were doing. And then you've got some emerging players as well that are not true running backs, but I think you're still going to see be involved in that whole scheme. Yeah,
Draylon Miller, Cam Michael, both guys, you can really move all over the place offensively. I went with Isaiah Augusta as well, and it seems like he's kind of become the alpha dog in that room. And don't get me wrong, like Michael Welsh has got all the dog you need in a running back, but I see Isaiah, a little bit further along in his development, just a little bit, and kind of the issue, I think, why we didn't see him early last season is that there were some fumble issues in practice, and then the CSU game happens, and he fumbles there.
Right.
He went to Coach Flea, who was the running backs coach at the time, and said that's not going to happen again. And if memory serves, I don't think he put another one on the ground the rest of last season. So if you can get that down, the pass protection aspect of it, I like Isaiah as kind of your set the pace guy, and then Welch being this kind of wild dog that you just throw out there and let him go wild out there. Receiver, let's do 4 of them.
Okay. And it's, for me, I kind of almost put this into 2 categories, and it's not based upon talent or anything, but it seems to me that Omarion Miller is your, he's your de facto number 1, right? And so coming into the season, so I think he starts at one spot, and I think that you've got Joe Williams at another spot who comes in and becomes your, I almost hate to say possession receiver because that almost degrades somebody, but he becomes your bigger bodied receiver.
Similar to Will Shepard.
And he's proven,
right?
Yeah. I actually like, personally, I like Joseph Williams better than I like Will Shepard coming in, just for some of the intangible things. But yeah, I think he becomes that body. But then, I look at, and so I've really got 5 names here because I look at, I think that Terrell Timmons is going to have a role, and I think part of that is going to be leadership. But I think also he's a talented receiver in his own right, and I think he's going to have a role. But it's going to be really hard to keep Draylon Miller and Cam Michael off the field.
Yeah.
But Cam Michael with his speed, and I think Draylon Miller because he's that player, and you started to see it last year, but I think that they're going to use in kind of a Deebo Samuels, slash, maybe the Joker role that Peyton likes so much with the Broncos and that he had in New Orleans. But he's going to be kind of your hybrid type guy that carries the ball, catches the ball, is involved, is physically mature and stout enough to be engaged in some cases almost like another tight end, out of a wing or something. So I really think those are the 5 guys that are going to stand out. But we'll kind of see how that all shakes out and how much they end up utilizing some of the tight ends that they've got now, which takes us right into tight ends, right?
Well, if you had to go with just 4, who are you knocking out of it?
So if I have to knock one out, I probably knock just based on a physical talent standpoint, probably Terrell Timmons, but I just think he's going to be so critical to this group with his
been a leader,
with his experience and his leadership. And I think he's a solid, dependable guy that you can count on. And you can't expect to go through a season without having some of your wide receivers banged up for, significant periods of time.
This was the first group that I really had to think about for a second. Same thing, torn between Terrell Timmons and Cam Michael. I ended up going with Michael as well. But yeah, that's a position where guys are going to rotate through. So the exercise on who's going to start is not as important as it is at quarterback and some of these other positions. Tight end, I had to think about this one for a second as well. I went with Zach Atkins. I'm enamored with this young man. You do some interviews that just stand out. I did an interview with him while I was covering the Alamo Bowl, and you could just tell that this was somebody that was going to come in extremely hungry and really had gone through an incredible transformation over his first 3 years of college. And if you're going to play at the D2 level, the school he went to is one of the perennial powerhouses in that conference. So it wasn't great competition in terms of what he's going to face going forward, but it was something that tested him, and he's been an absolute monster in the weight room since he got to campus. But Savell Smalls, he was better than I think a lot of people give him credit for last year, given the opportunities that he had in front of him. And Sam Hart was okay before he went down, so we didn't see a whole lot of him last year.
Right. Yeah, and I'm just excited to see how that group plays out. If I had to pick one guy that I think is going to really emerge, I think like you, it would probably be Atkins, and part of it is liking what you see and hear, maybe hear more than anything from him or hear about him. But I think like also he's still very shiny until he becomes started, right?
Yeah.
But I do think that Savell Smalls is going to play a big role, and we'll kind of see how some of the other guys, how all that shakes out. But I think that I was very impressed. Savell Smalls was one of my two players that I thought improved the most from the beginning of the season to the end of the season last year. And he really became a very serviceable inline tight end. And his physicality and his blocking and his his receiving was perfectly adequate. They didn't ask him to do a whole lot. I just think that a guy like Atkins brings a little more, some better tools, is a little more polished, and is coming into things with a receiver's mindset, to potentially be used in the passing game as more of a threat.
Yeah. I had a hard time with the interior offensive line. That in the third defensive line position. And yeah, those were the toughest things for me to decide. I'll let you lead off here. You can start a tackle if you want.
And that's my offensive line is I think you've got JC at one, at left tackle, and he's established, and he's going to be a stud this year, and probably battling for first team all conference honors. But I wouldn't be surprised if he gets some All-American push as well this year. And then I think that there's a solid group of guys potentially at the right tackle. I think Phil Houston came on through the course of the year and performed better than everybody thought. His big question mark right now is what's his return from injury going to look like, and what's his timetable going to be. Even though he was a little lower rated, I love the size and the physical maturity and what I saw on the field too from Jay Gardenhire. I mean, I think he's a guy that 6'8" could potentially create a battle at that right tackle spot. And then you've got Chrysler coming in from Illinois too. So I think there are some bodies. You got to figure out who ends up backfilling behind Seaton, and who emerges on the right-hand side. But I think there's some definite guys that kind of seem to be in the mix there ahead of time. But on the interior, I've got, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. They've got like 9 guys listed that it wouldn't shock me to see any combination of those 9 guys, which I love. I mean, I think it means that they've done, they've focused on it. They brought in a ton of size. So they brought in playing experience, a ton of size, some guys that performed really well at a level that was maybe a step down, and now want to try to do it at the FBS big school level. They brought in some guys that have been at big programs and just were never got playing time, but were never able to really just make that jump in front of whoever they were playing behind, and so they're hungry and they're enough talent that they were recruited into those teams. So yeah, I mean, there's so many names out there. I'm excited to see. And I wouldn't be surprised if it ends up being some of the guys that maybe people, have maybe overlooked with all the new names coming in too. So
I went with Chrysler at right tackle,
okay,
because of Houston's injury situation and just not knowing when he's going to be completely in the mix there. But yeah, inside, man, Aki Ogunbeyi, I think I pronounced that correctly. Ogunbeyi. Yeah. He was pretty solid, and has quite a bit of experience. So I'm going to go with him. Manatai Amani, somebody that's very mature at the other guard position. I've got Zarian McGill at center. Smart player at that position. And I did a story recently where I compared his stats with penalties with CU's offensive linemen, or starting centers, and it was like 3-1.
Yeah.
So he's been much more mature and smart as a center. Now he was playing at Louisiana Tech, so that maybe that plays into it as well. But there's many guys I could have gone with. Who would you have to go with?
If I had to go, so kind of, I actually feel like, because he's a little bit of a known commodity, and I think he did improve a lot last year as well, is I really like Harden. I liked him.
Yeah.
I liked him coming out of Florida when he transferred 2 years ago. It took him a little while to get his feet under him and to get an opportunity. And I think that he's every rep. I see him improving, so I think he's going to be tough to push out of a spot this year. I do like Ogunbaye, however you say the name. He was also one of the guys that I like. Yeah. Ogunbuye. Okay. Yee.
All right.
But no, so I think he's on there too, and I actually like McGill. I think Cash Cleveland's a great story. I think that his emergence was great, and he held his own. But I think when it comes to a pure physical talent standpoint, I think some of these other guys are kind of pass him by when there are more numbers. But like I said,
Tyler Brown has a ton of experience. Yeah, Tia, we've seen him do some stuff.
And I actually won't be shocked at all to see Yaya emerge, this season.
Defensive line, I think you got to put Jaheim Otis in there, assuming that he's healthy.
Mm-hmm.
Amari McNeil, to me, before he got hurt late last season, had found another gear as a player. I got to put him in there. Beyond that, I mean, that's going to be, it could be, are you going to go jumbo, maybe in some packages where you bring in Anquan Borens, but I went with Gabriel Lightfoot as my third, but was really kind of splitting hairs with some of these guys they brought in.
Right. I agree. I actually like them all. I kind of had the same as you. I had McNeil and Otis as kind of my start the game, the starting two. And then in terms of how they pair up after that, I'm not really sure. I like Tavian.
It kind of doesn't really matter because
I think you move bodies in and out, right?
The position that rotates the most.
Yep. Yeah. So I like Coleman and what he did at Texas State. I like Lightfoot. One of the, I mentioned that there were a couple of guys that I thought really improved over the course of last season, and Anquan Barnes is one of those guys. He, whether it was they had some depth, but I think he was one of those guys that Damian Lewis and Warren Sapp saw enough raw talent in that they were willing to continue to put him out there, have him learn his lessons, and work on improving. And he's a guy that when he would do things right was pretty impactful. I think with him, he just had a tendency that whether it was when he got tired or if he could not just physically dominate and win against somebody, then a lot of the teaching technique would go out the window, and he'd stand himself straight up and try to get around somebody to make a play instead of actually executing. But as the season went on, I think he improved and got a lot better. I don't think to the point where he's going to push for a starting job unless he takes additional steps in this offseason, but I really like him. And then you've got guys like, Tawfiq Thomas and Torian Carter that ended up being injured through the latter part of last season that I think were starting to really come on and play some good football, and they all bring something a little different in their own rights. So you get those guys in the mix, and then you've got some of the other guys that are kind of in that tweener role. The guys that are, I think and Alex McPherson is probably going to play some on the inside, probably not a first and second down type guy, but a third down guy on the inside or in some sort of a hybrid role. It'll be interesting to see what they do with Brandon Davis-Slane. He's almost grown himself into, an interior role, but he's still a little bit light and he still has some great athleticism. So I think in some ways he's a little bit like Alex McPherson. So yeah, it's almost for a CU fan especially, it's almost just an embarrassment of riches at this point.
Hey there, we got a guest here. Hungry to grab a table.
I think it's the sort of depth that CU has not had probably since, the late 80s, into 2000 on the defensive line. So.
Yeah. At edge, it's another group where you talk starters, but Tajay McCoy is going to get his reps out there. Keaton Wade is going to be out there on third down. London Merritt is going to have a role on this team based off everything we've heard about him. But you can't go away from Samuel Okunlola and Arden Walker. Can you?
No. And I love Arden Walker's story. I mean, I'm so impressed with the guy, and he overlapped with my son at Cherry Creek, so I got to see him play a lot in person and practice, and and I love seeing his growth. But I think those two become your set the edge type of defensive ends that have enough ability to also get after the passer. But then, like you said, you've got your Keaton Wades that you can use in a variety of different ways. I mean, they did so many things with him, and all he did was produce. But they would, sometimes stand him up, kind of as a linebacker and have him do different things from there. They would move him along the line. So I think he's great. Tajay McCoy has just emerged, and we knew that from the time he stepped on the field as a true freshman. That there was just, he needed to mature a little bit, but there was some innate physical gifts and talent that guy had, that who's gonna bring to the table. So, and then you've got the luxury of bringing in some guys like Merritt, and London Merritt, who I think nobody will be surprised to see him, see some significant snaps as a true freshman. Alex McPherson will probably play a little bit of edge, in some cases, and I think people also forget about one of the guys that I don't think he showed as much during game, on game film, but that people were talking about really improving and taking steps behind the scene was Quincy Wiggins. And that was,
it's rare in this day and age somebody who's willing to kind of work through not playing as much as he wanted to.
And especially a guy like that who, when he came out of high school and was recruited to LSU, I mean, he was an all-everything guy, and he's restarted himself and started, really working through things. And what I like about him is that late in the season, when he did get on the field and he would make plays, he was the most excited, energetic, like he was into it. So I think it's that whole group up front is just has so many potential contributors, and it'll be interesting to see how they all slot out.
William Gardner has joined us here at the Hungry Toad. It's almost a party.
We're getting there.
We got to get through this quickly then, because I'm getting hungry.
Okay.
I don't know about you. At linebacker, I went Martavius French and Reginald Hughes. Like what both those guys bring, and feel like they're kind of the top in terms of what they produced at this level.
And I agree with you there. I think that, and in some cases that's also because I think that was probably the biggest hole left, after last season with the departures. So they needed to figure something out. What I kind of put my faith in is that, that they went out and very specifically that Rob Livingston, I'm sure, had quite a bit of input on what he wanted to see in those positions. And so last year he came into a team that was already a roster that was already formed. This year, I think he had some input, and so I think these are guys that he sees like he can build around, and can have a role and can do some things that he can utilize, some skill sets. So I like them, and I still like some of the returning guys too. That I think that there's a definite role for for a JV, and there's a definite role for a Wester, and then you got Mantrez Walker coming in, who I think still needs some development. I mean, he's physically a big boy, but I think he needs some development. But I wouldn't be surprised to see him be very involved, at least in special teams. But I agree with you on the two starters.
Nickelback, I mean, you got to go with Preston Hodge. That's a role that he played last
Absolutely.
year. We'll obviously talk about him this offseason, but I don't think there's any controversy there unless somehow you wanted to flip Colton Hood with him. But I feel like Colton Hood's better at quarterback at this stage.
Oh, I agree too. I think Colton Hood is the guy that I think he becomes CB1 on this team, which doesn't take anything away from DJ McKinney, but I think he's just that dog that you put on the outside, you lock him up against the other team's best guy, and you go. And there may be some games where he and Preston Hodge. I mean, I think Preston Hodge is a great nickel, but there may be games where, depending on the matchup, you even have those guys swap roles because you've got Colton, kind of being the lockdown guy. And they did that a little bit with Travis last year, but I think Colton gives you a little more ability because you don't have to worry about him wearing out. You don't have to be cognizant about what he's doing on offense and defense. So.
Yeah, obviously DJ McKinney, who you mentioned. At safety, this one took a second for me. I put Carter Stoutmeyer in there. But another guy, if there's an injury at nickelback, can move there. I don't think at corner they're going to need him going forward because they've got some depth that we'll talk about going forward. Did you have Carter Stoutmeyer as one of yours?
I ended up with him, and it was really, for me, it was a question between Carter Stoutmeyer and Savion Riley, actually.
Okay.
I like Savion Riley, and, I think that, Tufik Baird gets the other spot. I think he becomes that, that other safety that comes in with experience and with some of that dog mentality, and everything that you hear about him is that there's going to be not a lot of drop off from a leadership and competitive standpoint from Cameron Craig to him, and which is great because that's, like we talked about, needing the leadership as well as the on the field ability. Carter he's one of those guys who's been like the Swiss Army knife, and he's played really well everywhere you put him, but I think he hasn't been able to focus on one spot enough to really emerge as a standout. So it'll be interesting to see what happens, and I think that maybe that's what happens, through fall camp. But
he might be the furthest developed at safety at this point, but when you look at kind of his lineage and just his frame and how well for the program as well, how they've recruited cornerback, it's tough to find elite safeties. It's a little bit easier, especially when Deion Sanders is your head coach, to find cornerbacks. I feel like that's a good point, that like you'd love to be able to have him spend a year one spot.
Yeah. And I think that maybe they've got the ability to do that a little more than they have in the past because they've filled out some of that secondary depth now. That they may be able to start kind of just letting guys settle in, and I'm actually I'm really excited to see through spring too what RJ Johnson looks like. Coming back this year, and
it sounds like he's at corner now.
Have they moved him to corner? Okay.
That's what he was saying. Yeah.
Well, and again, that just goes to all that flexibility that they've got on that defense, because I think he's a guy that I thought had some potential. And where do they see him fit best, and what does he need, and and then I think we're talking about this year. I think down the road, I think Antonio Branch is going to be a tremendous safety for these guys. But he's a guy that needs Coach Carl needs to get some cornbread in him before he's ready to play some significant snaps on a D1 defense. I think.
I don't know if he's going to start. You never know how injuries are going to happen during the season. But one guy that you can't really talk about at these positions that we need to talk about is Isaiah Harge.
Oh yeah,
You talk about versatility. I mean, there's a lot.
And he's another guy that you kind of forget about a little bit, or don't forget about, but he hasn't had an opportunity to really just settle in anywhere and play significant
But
snaps.
he almost thrives in that, right? There's some guys, I have some positions, like you're talking about Carter Stottmeyer maybe being an NFL safety prospect in a couple years. You got to be able to develop there.
Yep.
Isaiah Harge is just a flat-out athlete, and it's kind of fun the way that they utilize him in these different roles. And he was probably one of the highlights of the spring game last year. Was just who was playing running back? Oh, Isaiah Harge, and
right.
he was pretty solid in that role.
Yep. Yeah, and I think he's a guy, and he's got that gray jersey. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see him, still fill a variety of roles. I think that he is a player that I completely expect to emerge this year. I think the big question is where.
Yeah. Yep. All right. Well, we're going to get to the party here at the Hungry Toad in Boulder, and we'll be back after spring ball, and we're going to have reaction to what we thought before spring and what we saw during those 15 practices.
I'm sure it'll all be just like we laid it out.